My name's Monk Rowe, and I'm here for the Fillius Jazz Archive in Cortland, New York with drummer and bandleader Danny D'Imperio. Thanks for joining me.
My pleasure.
You and I are only a few years apart, and I have some vivid memories of what grabbed me as a kid musically, and I'm wondering what grabbed you.
Well, first of all, my father, who was that man there, was a musician. And I was born on March 14th, 1945 in Sydney, New York. And we lived in Unadilla, New York. And he quit playing. At that time, he was 4 years old. That was on the centerfold of the New York Times, along with Crown Prince Hirohito, who was 16 years old. I've got the original newspaper upstairs. It's just barely holding together. But he quit playing drums when he was about 5, so that took care of it. I mean, you can see by those drums, I mean, with that gooseneck hanging down. Actually, it's hard to see, but there actually is a cymbal that's attached to the bass drum pedal. They didn't have hi-hat cymbals in those days. And so, like, when you hit the drum, the cymbal would also hit the drum with the bass drum beater.
Okay.
I'd love to have that set of drums, but I don't know whatever happened to it. But anyway, he quit playing drums shortly thereafter, and around the age of 12 or 13 he contracted rheumatic fever and stayed home from school for 1 year as a result, and learned how to play the piano. So when I was born, he worked for the War Department. He couldn't get in the service at that time because of the rheumatic heart, so he worked for the War Department and played piano on the side. So my first recollections when we lived in Unadilla, New York, on the coffee table in the living room were the old 78 albums, which you'd open them up, there'd be 4 or 5 78s in it, and it'd be Fats Waller, Art Tatum, you know, people like that, Artie Shaw, you know, all of the famous guys at the time. So I got kind of attracted to that. I said, you know, like they put them on the record player, and I rocked like I'm rocking now. I rocked so much in my crib upstairs in my bedroom that I actually, and I've got the scar to this day, rocked my crib into the hallway, and the whole crib came right down the stairs. My mother and father thought I was dead, but the scar is there. One of the scars is there. I'll tell you about the other one, which I got later on. And but I was always rocking. I just always loved to rock, even in a car, even in a straight chair. I rock. I don't know why, but I do. But the music was always in the house. And my uncle was a bass player. My grandfather, who lived to be 100, was a violin player and a shoemaker. And his wife, my grandmother, my father's mother, was a pianist. Not a jazz pianist, but a pianist. And they played the theater circuit with this fascination of a 4-year-old drummer. And they wound up playing the Hippodrome Theater in New York City with Baby Rosemarie, who was later on, I believe, the Dick Van Dyke show, Rosemarie.
Yeah.
And she was on the bill as well in the Hippodrome Theater. So that was the way that started. But my fascination came from the musical part of my family.
Was the Italian?
I'm Italian. I'm 3/4 Italian, 1/4 Irish. My grandmother, the pianist, was born in Ireland. It's a nice combination.
No kidding.
And the other 3 are Italians.
I just wondered, you know, the Italians often have a musical heritage and with the mandolins and all that.
Well, he was a violinist.
Yeah.
And baritone horn player, too. My grandfather, I'm talking.
Do you recall if the music that you were getting into, were your parents using the word jazz, or was it just the music that was in the house?
Well, I mean, first of all, I was 4 years old when it started, so I don't know if it was swing or big band. I can't really recall the word jazz until later on, and when we moved to Buffalo in 1949, and that's when the jazz started to come into play. But I mean, as I recall, it was like the big band era, the swing era, you know, like Benny Goodman, all of that. The jukeboxes would be loaded with that kind of music, you know. All of, you know, Stardust and I Can't Get Started With You and Begin the Begin, Artie Shaw, and all of that stuff, you know.
So by the time you were in like junior high school, had you decided on your career path?
Well,
so
we
to
can
speak?
start a little bit earlier than that. When we moved to Buffalo, my father decided I was going to be a piano player.
Oh.
And I took piano lessons, and we lived in downtown Buffalo for a couple of years, and I started learning out of the Thompson method. And then in 1952, we moved to Cheektowaga, New York, which is a suburb of Buffalo. And every time we moved, I'd have to change piano teachers, excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
And that piano teacher would start me over with their method. So like I was becoming very, very disenchanted. You know, like, okay, I've got to this point, but no, I want to start you the way I teach. So that we'd start over. Then we moved here in Cortland, to Cortland in 1953, and I started again on piano. By this time I was becoming very disenchanted with the piano, although I wish I had stuck with it, because it sure was a lot easier to play an acoustic piano than it was to lug that stuff around. So anyway, that thing kind of fizzled out. And then I took up the trumpet. That lasted for a couple years, right up here at Parker Schools, a couple blocks away. And that was okay, but that didn't work out either. And in 1956, the Tommy and Jimmy Dorsey, the Dorsey Brothers Orchestra came to Cortland, and you went by it on your way here. It's a place called Skateland. It was a roller skating rink. Now it's just a vacant building. It became Grossman's Lumber, and it's just a building up there. Well, we went in that summer, and I still hadn't focused on what my father just said. He hasn't got it. He just doesn't have it, man. You know what I mean? He's not going to be a musician, because I had dropped 2 instruments.
But he wanted you to be.
Well, he wanted me to be exposed to music.
Okay.
I'm not sure he wanted me to. I wanted it quite the way it went, as you will find out later in the interview. But I walked into that thing it was July of 1956, and at that time, Jackie Gleason was big, but he would have a summer replacement, and it was Tommy and Jimmy Dorsey. In fact, that summer replacement was the summer replacement. One of the episodes of the summer replacement was when the juggler was on the show of the Dorsey Brothers, when Charlie Parker was watching it as he died. In fact, in the movie you see the juggler, and in the scene when he's in the Stanhope Hotel with Baroness de Koningswater, they use the actual scene. Well, that summer they also went on the road. So anyway, I walked in there, and the drummer was Louis Bellson. Pearl Bailey, he was married to Pearl Bailey, and she was in an automobile sitting behind the place. She didn't come in, but he drove separately from the band. And he did a drum solo. Now, I'm not 100% sure it was skin deep, because that was what he did with Duke Ellington. But since it was his arrangement, and I'm sure he owned the rights to it, it very well could have been skin deep. I just know that it was pretty deep. And I watched him. Charlie Shavers was playing trumpet. Lee Castle was in the trumpet section, which was neither here nor there. Frank Maines. And then they broke down to I think they call it the Clam Bake 7 when they went to a Dixieland band. But the band was ferocious, man, absolutely ferocious. And Louis Bellson was ferocious. So I said to my father, why don't I try the drums? So we went down to a local music store. And he wasn't going to buy me a set of drums, because he had seen me lose interest in other things. So we bought a practice pad, a pair of drumsticks, and Duke Ellington's Ellington Uptown, which featured Louis Bellson playing skin deep. Well, from then on, it was pretty much drums for me.
Louis Bellson was with the Dorsey Brothers after Ellington.
Yes. He was with that record that Ellington Uptown, I believe, was in 52 or 3. Okay. And they came here in 56. July of 56. For Christmas that year, I had never touched the drum up until this point. But at a practice pad, and I wrecked pillows, and I was ruining the furniture, playing along with it. think I had a cardboard drum, or like one of those things kids get.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not going to last long, especially if you're trying to play skin deep, which I mean, I never could play that anyway. But
That's okay.
the thing is that that whole bit, that Christmas, I got a snare drum, a 26-inch bass drum, and one steel cymbal. I mean, it was steel. It was not brass or anything. It was just a steel. I've never seen one like it before or since. I gave it to somebody else just as a thing, but he wasn't even going to give me a hi-hat stand yet. He said, "You got to make sure that." But see, he played piano, and he had an organo attachment, which is a thing you may or may not be familiar with. But you used to put things underneath the piano keys, and you could use, and this big amplifier on the side made the piano sound like an organ, and you'd control the volume or the thing that came out and you move your legs. So he would play all the left hand, and he would be playing. He was a very strict timekeeper anyway.
It was called a what?
An organo.
Organo attachment.
O-R-G-A-N-O. It's
Wow.
a great big amp, like a big amp. And he had to have to come and put all of the things underneath the piano keys, and then just turn the thing on, and then it had little things. So it made it like an organ sound, and he'd play the bass, and I'd be playing along with it. But he was so strict on me, and he was playing with Spiegel Wilcox's band at the time, and Spiegel and the guys would always, and in other words, I got this thing, and as the time went on, that spring. He would bring the guys in, and as I would improve, I mean, they started coming in when I had the pad, just come in, have a drink before going to a job. Mm-hmm. And he would criticize me pretty bad. I mean, it was kind of embarrassing, actually, because if I screwed up the time or overplayed a drum break, I mean, he'd say, "You overplayed that break," and then they'd all get in the car and drive off to the job, and they'd leave me alone with my muse, you know, like, and I would feel sad about it, you know, but I mean, it wasn't like he was being mean, it was just a strict fact.
Wow.
But my first job came in July of 1957, a wedding reception, and you're looking at a guy right now who's 69 years old, and you're looking also at a guy who's never worked a day in his life, ever. Now, the Army was considered training. I mean, I did basic training and then went into Army bands. Yeah. But, I mean, I don't consider that working. That's training.
Okay.
So I played my first job. I made $9. I shared a paper route with another guy once, a half a paper route. So I did have a half a paper route. Wouldn't take a full one. Working was just not in my comfort zone once I made that $9 for 3 hours. I said, that's it, rather than getting 50 cents to mow or rake a lawn. So it started at 57.
I know exactly what you're saying.
I'm not sure that this is the best information for any students who may be watching.
I agree. I mean, I made $4 on my first gig. But I made $35 on my first New Year's Eve gig when I was still in high school, and I said, oh my God.
I know.
You know, but I think it's interesting that your father said, you overplayed that break.
Like, in other words, at the end of a tune, like, the LP was coming in at that time too. You know, between 1949, I think Columbia was the originator of the long playing record. They used to be on 10 inches, but
yeah.
There was 2 records that I remember particularly on that table when we moved to Cortland, moved here, was Harry James' One Night Stand, and he had a drummer named Jackie Mills who absolutely floored me. But what was even more impressive, or as impressive, was a Ted Heath record called Live at the London Palladium, and the drummer was Ronnie Verrill. And to this day, when I play that record, I get excited. I mean, Ronnie Verrill, he was a devotee, or his main inspiration was Don Lemond, and he played those Don Lemond breaks like abstract breaks, but man, that band was on fire, and I would be listening to that, and then the Salt City Five was a Dixieland band that had won the Arthur Godfrey show, and that was one of the records on the table, and I wore the cushions and the couch out playing along to that with a drummer named Bob Cousins, and I later went with the Salt City Six, and I finally got to meet Bob Cousins, and actually played bass with him, because I played the bass as well, not as well, I mean, in addition to the drums, and I actually got to play with one of my idols was him. And then well, we can continue on with the Don Lemon, Jay Ken, and that thing, but that's where that went. Then I got in, if you want to go, I'll let you ask the question.
Yeah, were you developing, by the time you were in your teens and so forth, any kind of personal filter? Oh, I really want to play this kind of music, and I don't care for this kind of music too much. Or was it just like a gig is a gig?
No, it wasn't quite like that. You see, because of what I told you was on that table, there was the Salt City Five, which was Dixieland. Then Eddie Condon's music called Jam Session Coast to Coast, which had the Rampart Street Paraders on one side with Nick Fatul, great drummer, and on the other side was the Condon Band, which was just dynamite with Wild Bill Davison and all those guys. And then there was a big band, so like I was in between in the Ellington Uptown, and I was right in between, so I had to learn. I learned all of these Dixieland songs because Spiegel's band was coming out of that thing, because he had played with Bix Beiderbecke and the Gene Goldcat Orchestra. So I pretty much came out of the direction of big band to small groups to like, we would play another record that was on the table was the soundtrack from the Benny Goodman story. Now here I'm listening to Gene Krupa play Swing, Sing, 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 and I'm playing it on the floor, you know, there's keeping my father awake as he's taking a nap, getting ready to go to a gig. He'd say, "You gotta stop, I'm taking a nap." But on one side of that was the Benny Goodman Trio playing China Boy and Avalon, but the quartet was with Hamp. So I started playing that music. So I mean, it was all subsumed. It was subsumed as just being jazz.
Oh, that's so interesting, because I had the same experience with the soundtrack from the Glenn Miller movie.
Mm-hmm.
Big band, and I know some Louis Armstrong cuts on the other side,
Right.
one side, because he was in the movie.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
It's funny you would say that, because Mo Pirtle, the original drummer with the Glenn Miller Band, who's on that, sat right here and played drums. He became a friend of mine. And my father played piano over there. I played the bass, and Mo was right there. What a thrill to meet. I mean, I met Mo, and we became good friends.
Yeah.
He was one of my heroes too, because one Christmas I got that little deluxe edition 45s of the Glenn Miller edition with Mo Pirtle, and that was one of the records that I had when I got that set of drums. I didn't even know how to tune a set of drums, because it was calfskin heads in those days. I didn't know if you're supposed to loosen them up on hot summer days. One day I woke up in the morning and all my drum heads were split because the sun was beating down on them and they tightened up. I said, "Who's been playing my drums?" Nobody, they've just been sitting in the sun.
Did your fellow, if you had friends that were musicians, were they jealous, or were they enthralled by your, quote, road gigs and stuff? Or were they aware that you were doing that?
Well, are you talking in high school
in
years?
high school, yeah.
I was just gone. I mean,
Okay.
I think maybe a couple of them thought that my girlfriend might be available, which wasn't the case. But I don't recall. I guess so. I guess they could have been jealous, but they weren't. See, I was into the jazz thing, you know. And they were into Buddy Holly and that kind of thing, you know. I mean, Ronnie Dio's from Cortland, you know. I mean, Ronnie Padavana, his name was Ronnie Padavana, but his name he went with Ronnie Dio. I don't know if you remember him,
Sure.
Black Sabbath or something like that.
Right.
He passed away a couple of years ago. And there were several famous musicians from Cortland. I mean, Ray Crisera played with Toscanini, and there was Arnold Gabriel had the Air Force Band for like 30 years. He was the conductor of that.
What's his name?
Arnold Gabriel.
Okay.
It was funny, like Toscanini's son, his father was old Frank Crisera, and they had the Old Timers Band here in Cortland. And all of the musicians, which was they still have it, but it's not the Old Timers. I mean, they're all gone. I mean, they were Old Timers when I was 50 years ago. They were Old Timers. They still call it the Old Timers Band. I guess guys like me are in it, but I don't play in it. But so he comes home from playing with Toscanini, and they're having a rehearsal, and Frank Crisera, a handlebar mustache guy like this, and all of the trumpet players are naturally going to give the lead trumpet part to his son, Ray Crisera, who I think is still alive, teaching school in Austin, Texas. Fantastic trumpet player. Fantastic. And he had the Italian accent because I used to live down in Italy. So he starts playing and they're playing or whatever it is, and he looks back and he sees that his son is playing the solo cornet or solo trumpet, first trumpet, solo cornet it was. He said, "What the hell is going on around here?" He says, "These guys, they come in here every week over here. He says, "Why you?" He says, "Maybe you play a first chair with Toscanini and you play a last chair with me." You know, and here's Bob Britanno and all of these guys. I mean, what are they going to do? I said, "Fine."
That's cool.
But he was one of the famous guys from Cortland. There's been a few of them from here.
You know, you mentioned Buddy Holly and that era of rock and roll. When I listen to that music, in fact, I play a lot of it now. A lot of it's basically swing music.
Actually, it is.
Right? Rock Around the Clock is a swing song.
It doesn't have an 8-beat feel. It's
right.
like, you know, like...
Yeah, but that music didn't...
It didn't. Well, for them, I mean, I didn't want to be... I mean, rhythm and blues was nice. You know, Louis Jordan, there's another one, Louis Jordan and the Timpani Five. That was something that was sitting on the dining room table, like, you know, like your feet... I can't remember all the names of the tunes. I've still got them there. But, I mean, that was... Earl Bostic, all those were swing music, you know. But when it went into 8-beat, when it started becoming the twist, you know, that's when I kind of lost interest in it.
Can I ask you about what I don't think I've heard that term in a long time, 8-beat.
Well, 8-beat meaning straight eights as opposed to like a shuffle or a ding ding ka ding, you know, like the right hand's playing eighth notes.
Okay.
Because I always
even up and down eighth
right,
notes.
and I like to play that kind of music because that freed me up, which a lot of guys didn't do. See, a lot of the swing players played 4 on the floor. So even though Blakey feathers the bass drum and all those guys, and so do I, but it's not like a pounding 4 on the floor. We call it 4 on the floor. But I like to do the. Once I started hearing the some guys dropping bombs, that's when I said, "Yeah, now that frees me up to like not be necessarily," because once the bass amps came in, the timekeeper in the band was the bass player, really. You know, he's the one that's laying the time down, and I'm there to shade and color. You know, I'm not, you know, somebody say, well, it's dragging or it's rushing. Well, I mean, yeah, you can put an edge on the beat or put it behind the beat or whatever. I mean, I've got Miles Davis record, Miles at the Blackhawk, when they start Bye Bye Blackbird at a certain tempo, and it's almost a ballad by the time it ends, but it's swinging all the way down.
It's swinging all the way down.
Yeah.
Yow.
But I mean, to just sit there and bum, bum, ba-dum, you know, I like to like bum, you know, like break it up a little bit.
I think that's very interesting what you just said about the bass player.
Yeah, there's a timekeeper.
I agree.
Especially when amps came in. Now, when they were just back there when they couldn't be heard, you know, they had to have the strings a lot higher off the fingerboard because they had to pull harder. But then now you got the amp, let the amp do the work. I can put the thing down and the facility's more there, and it changed.
So what happens if the bass player starts being looser with the time, and you are too, and a drummer is too?
Well, when you say looser with the time, you mean you're talking? Are you thinking of Bill Evans with Scott LaFaro?
I guess just bass players who want to be more involved in
interplay with the right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that was where Scott LaFaro came into the game, and Bill Evans, and that's when things started to change. But at that point, the music was changing, but it didn't mean that you didn't have to have that metronome in your head. You still had to know where it was, you know. But everybody had to know then. It wasn't somebody sitting there with a metronome keeping track of it. You know, I mean, it was in your head at that point.
When was the first Bop record that you heard, or did you hear Bop live first? How did it sort of enter?
First Bop record I ever heard was when my father, we went over to Oneonta, I think, Oneonta, New York, and they used to have, in those days, they used to have speakers outside of the music store playing the latest things, you know, that kind of thing. Man, we went in there, and I've still got the original '78. It was One Bass Hit by Dizzy Gillespie, woo. And on one side was the big band version, on the other side was the small band version, man. And I've still got that 78. And I said, that's got my attention, you know. That did get my attention. And that was the first one, but that would have been in the early 50s as well. And I hadn't even started drums yet, but I did like it.
Did you start leaning towards that kind of music? To play bop or hard bop?
Well, as I said earlier, we used to go to New York to go to a certain optician. Let me see, is it an optician or is it a...
Optometrist or...
No, the guy that's the doctor.
Yeah, the doctor.
That's an optician, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you're right.
Not an optometrist, not the guy that makes the glasses. No, this is an optician that we had known. And as I say, we'd go to the things, and I was starting to get into listening to the bebop pretty good then. Although we would always go to Nick's, we'd always go to Condon's. We went to the Metropole one day. We sat there for 8 hours listening to Coleman Hawkins and Charlie Shavers, and Mickey Sheen was a great drummer then too. He's since passed away, and I was in awe. And then they had two bands. The other band was Cozy Cole with Roy Eldridge and certain guys like that, which was amazing too. And I mean, I was just staring at this. I said, man, this is something else.
I wanted to ask you a question, sort of rewind. You saw Charlie Shavers in the Dorsey band, just down the street from here.
That's right.
Was there any, of course you were pretty young, but was there any significance to the fact that here's this black man playing with, he probably was the only black person in the band, right?
That's correct. Except for Pearl Bailey,
who
was not in the band, was in the back.
In the car.
In the car.
Do you remember that? Any significance to that?
I remember that what they had done was there was the hit song that he had at that time. Of course, he had two hits. No, I mean Tommy Dorsey had a couple of hits. One was "Song of India," the other was "Marie." But what they had done was they had transcribed Bunny Berrigan's original chorus on Marie for the entire trumpet section. Oh. And man, when Charlie Shavers hit that night with that, I'm not sure that he had the lead part or not. I wouldn't be surprised by what he didn't, but when he did, it just blew the place apart. And you know, like whether he took it up an octave, I can't remember because that's so far in the past. But I knew that he, and then he came down. I'm not sure if he came down to play with the Clambake Seven or Lee Castle might have, but no, Charlie Shavers came down when they broke down to this. It was the band within the band. You know, they used to have bands within the bands.
But there was no...
I didn't think much about black and white, you know,
right.
Especially when I got in the Army.
And were you drafted?
No, I went on the road. Well, I'll explain that one. Okay, graduate from high school. I was accepted. I wanted to get to Potsdam because Prof. Stanley was up there. But once again, the physical attraction I had to the female I was going with in high school probably cost me commendable grades. So I got a letter from Prof. Stanley. He said, you are head and shoulders above any of the drummers up here, but we can't let you in, man, because your grades aren't high enough. I got out of high school with band, orchestra, chorus, and theory. I mean, I just barely got out. I couldn't wait to get out anyway. Yeah. Except that and then I went on. I was going to go to. I got accepted to Ithaca College because I had studied with Warren Benson back when I was at St. Mary's with no band director there, and I had paid my $200 initiation fee, and I was had a jam session with a bass player now deceased named Tony Leonardi, and a whole jam, Frank Pizzulo, a bunch of guys from Syracuse area. And he was with Jimmy Cavallo's band. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He made a movie called Rock Around the, not Rock, or I don't know, Jimmy Cavallo and the House Rockers. We call it Jimmy Cavallo and the House Wreckers. But the phone call came in, come out here to New Bedford and join the band. This was like I graduated on Thursday, I'm on the road on Sunday. And I did that for the entire summer and didn't go to Ithaca College. Tony said there's no reason to go over there. Mm-hmm. And I didn't. So I lost the initiation fee, which $200 in 1963 was $200. I mean, it was probably about $1,000 now. Yeah. I don't know. Mm-hmm. So I went on the road for the summer with that.
The House Rockers.
Yeah, what was that called? Rock?
You're right.
Rock or something?
Rock, I can't remember.
It wasn't Rock Around the Clock.
I know the band you're talking about. And this was like a very hyped up shuffle.
Yeah, there was a lot of different people. Connie Francis was in that movie. I mean, there was a movie. I mean, they made a movie. I wasn't. It's before I was with the band.
What did being on the road constitute? Like one-nighters in dance clubs?
No, well, I mean, depending on which band I was with. I went on the road with the Jimmy Cavallo, and we were playing week-long engagements. We were like a week at the Thunderbird Lounge and wherever, New Bedford, Massachusetts, Piccadilly Lounge. And I remember they used to have a tank of piranha that was the high point of the evening, because we'd play on top of the bar and the bartender would feed the piranha something. I don't know what he was feeding them, goldfish I guess. And that was fun. But that was a club that was booking like Sonny Stitt one week, and then Jimmy Cavallo, we're there, okay. And this and that. And then we do Lancaster, we do Hazleton, I can't remember, Thunderbird Lounge, I can't remember the name of all the places. But the bread was so light, it was just no bread at all. I mean, $75 a week, but I mean, still it was better than, I was getting my experience anyway. But I wasn't getting any reading experience, you see. Mm-hmm. And even though I had played timpani and played grade 6 drum solos, things like that, and during high school, and I mean, I went to All State, down at the Concord Hotel and all this and that. But that kind of reading was different than reading jazz music, because when you read an eighth note, pop, 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 but if you get, like, you read an eighth note in jazz, it's like ba, ba, da, ba, da, like you're hearing the syncopation. I see an eighth note and it's like ba, da, not right. Ba, ba, so that kind of thing. So I wasn't really locked into that, but I had been with the Salt. Now I quit Jimmy Cavallo's band, went back with the Salt City Six, for a couple of years, I guess. And we were traveling, doing Florida, and I don't remember the places, wherever they were. And those were nice jobs. But I played a session on bass one night with some guys, and there was no bass player, so they said, start playing bass. So I said, well, I'll play bass in the band, that's fine with me. So I got to play with Billy Eckstein, and the drummer was Charlie Persip. I am playing bass with Charlie Persip, who was one of my favorite big band drummers from Dizzy Gillespie's big band. That's another record that I was kind of weaned on, Dizzy at Newport, that kind of thing. Here I'm playing bass with Charlie Persip playing drums. Patty Page, I played the bass on that show. I wound up playing the bass on the second time on the Frankie Lane show. We called it the Frankly Lame show.
Frankly Lame, yeah.
Yeah, we had a bunch of things. I can't remember. But what happened was, a girl singer came in named Donna Valeri, and that's spelled D-A-N-A. A lot of people call her Dana Valerie, but it was Donna Valeri, and she was Sergio Franchi's sister. Her real name is Fausta Gali. They're from Johannesburg, South Africa. Sergio Franchi was, at the time, he's since passed away, was a kind of like a Mario Lanza kind of singer. And she was looking for a conductor. She wanted somebody to travel with her. She was doing it on her own. She was kind of up and coming, but she didn't want a piano. She wanted a drummer, because every time she went someplace, the drummers were not up to what she wanted. But I am playing bass on her show. But somebody said, no, this guy's a great drummer. Well, somebody said he's a fine drummer. Mm-hmm. So I said, well, why don't you come down to my house and have some spaghetti? My mother will cook it for you. Which impressed her. Anyway, I went on the road with her for a year, 1969. I traveled with her. We went to, California. We did Mr. Kelly's in Chicago. We did Washington, Puerto Rico, whatever that. But we did the Persian Room in New York City. And here I am, the drummer, conducting the band. So I have to learn how to. I had taken conducting classes, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, but I had to learn how to do it just reverse and play with the right hand. Let's see, I can't remember even how I know. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. So I had to get all of these conducting things down like that. So I was their drummer conductor for a year, and it was fairly interesting. But I had also, prior to that, done a week or a few days with Buddy DeFranco's Glenn Miller Orchestra, but had to go back with Donna Valeri. And the call came about a year later. Donna came up, spent Christmas, she and her husband of the time, came up to our house and stayed there, put a nice little gift in the tree for me. And as soon as she got back to New York, I called and quit.
Oh, yeah?
Because I had got a call to go with I'm moving this rocking chair. I got a call to go with the Glenn Miller band, and they were going to Japan. Now, here's my ticket back. I said, okay, I'll go. But, and we were going to London as well. So I quit and joined the Buddy DeFranco Glenn Miller Orchestra. And we went to, we did a recording live in London at the Royal Festival Hall. Now this was, I had never been this sick in my life. I was playing 2 bass drums then. I was endorsing Ludwig drums. Buddy DeFranco was a pretty serious taskmaster with time. I mean, because of the dancers, he didn't want anybody stumbling over their feet. Mm-hmm. So there wasn't a lot of looseness involved with that band, and the Glenn Miller office didn't want to vary too far from the Glenn Miller sound. So it was a learning experience, and it was I had come out of the Army, and I said, gee, here I am back in the Army, you know, that kind of thing. And I did that for, we went to London, and I had one steak over there. Everything was fish and chips. The bars were closed at the wrong time. I mean, it seemed though I just couldn't, you know, like they closed at 2 o'clock, and then we were traveling, and they reopened at 5, and by the time the job ends, they're closed. I couldn't get loaded. I couldn't do anything. But I'm staying at the London Strand, ghosting. We call it ghosting. You ever heard of ghosting?
Mm-hmm. You could explain it, though.
Ghosting means that one guy checks into a hotel room and 2 guys live in it, and you break the bed down, and one sleeps on the bed spring, one sleeps that, and you split the bill, because the Glenn Miller Band didn't pay for rooms. And I'm on the floor, but I wake up on the day of this recording session, of this live concert, which was 2 concerts, which means 4 sets. We got to do the whole show twice. And Bugle Call Rag was one of the tunes, and I mean, that thing was that thing was, it was fast. And I called him Buddy DeFranco. My ghost went downstairs and said, Buddy, I don't think Danny can even stand up, man, which I basically couldn't. It was food poisoning. Ooh. I had food poisoning. And I told Buddy, I said, you got to call Ronnie Verrill or somebody's going to have to come in and do this job. I can't even walk. And they sent a doctor, which was socialized medicine at the time, and he came up to the room and he said, this is the strongest thing I have for nausea and everything else. He gave me a shot. I couldn't even go over for the sound check. I couldn't do anything. I just got in a cab and went to Royal Festival Hall and played it twice. I mean, 2 shows, and I managed to get through it. And it came out on a record, although my drum solo on the record that was released on Paramount Records here was cut to 1.5 minutes. Japan recently released it, and it's an 8-minute drum solo. How I did that, I'll never know. And twice that night. Wow. But that was the sickest I've ever been on a bandstand in my life, recording live for I don't know how many people Royal Festival Hall holds. But and then on the cover of the record, I'm on the cover of the record with DeFranco and this and that.
Jeez, something to be said for adrenaline, I guess.
I guess, yeah.
Well, I've got to jump ahead a little bit because we're well into our 2nd hour here. But you got your family home from Korea.
I left the band in Japan and went to Korea and brought them back. Mm-hmm. And then Gap Mangione was in there someplace. I used to play with him. Oh yeah, then I went with Jack Mayhew, and then I went with Gap Mangione's trio for a couple of years. And we were playing on top of a bar. We did so many, he played 2 jobs a day. Steve Davis was the bass player who had been on John Coltrane's My Favorite Things.
Right.
And
At the top of the plaza or something like that in Rochester?
No, that's where I played. The top of the plaza was across the street. That's where I did a thing with Maynard Ferguson.
Okay, yeah.
So, but Link Milliman had come to my high school because he had gone to Fredonia with Don Menza, who had gotten him on Maynard's band, and he came here because he was a school friend of the choral director. And I met him, so then I worked with him off and on with Jack Mayhew's Salt City Six. And Randy, the band was now an English band becoming an American band again. Half English, half American. Randy Jones was the drummer. And he was leaving, so the drummer, or the bass player, Rick Patrone, asked Link if he knew any drumming. He said, yeah, call Danny D'Imperio. So now I'm getting on the bandstand with Gap, and the phone rings at the bottom in the bar, and they wanted me to come with the band. And I get up on the bandstand with Gap. I said, Maynard Ferguson needs a drummer. He said, tell him to call a union. In other words, he was PO'd because he didn't want me to cut out. But I had always wanted to play with Maynard's band, even though the band was in transition. It wasn't the Rocky band yet. It was the Chameleon band, you know.
Right.
I did that record with them.
Yeah.
We were still playing quite a bit of jazz, Aragen,
Three Little Foxes. Or
three more Foxes, the Fox Hunt, this and that.
Yeah.
So I went with that band for a year.
What is that? I'm trying to think how to phrase this question. That booze and so forth, and controlled substances, and jazz. Why is that almost considered to be synonymous? Is it partly because you spend so much time on the bus and in hotel rooms and stuff, and you have all this time on your hands, or is it just like this?
Somebody once said that the only time a musician should drink is while he works, or is when he's working.
Yeah.
But you got so much time. You work 4 hours a day. I mean, I hate to say work play because I've never worked a day in my life.
Right.
But I mean, you're basically playing. But I mean, when you're on the bus, man, it's party time. You know, like if you're traveling, you got an 8-hour ride. What are you gonna do? I mean, sit there and you know, I mean, some guys played cards, but most of us would be listening to music and getting drunk or getting high, and you burn it off on the bandstand. But it's an occupational hazard. There's no question about that.
Because oftentimes you're playing in places, and you're in a gin joint or whatever.
Gin mill, yeah.
Gin mill, yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, that's when you should drink, is while you play. We used to have the booze on the. I went to Eddie Condon's club. I mean, I played there for 3 years after that. I was a house drummer there. But I don't know how far you want to get into this. So you probably want to get into the Woody Herman years. And
Sure. But you survived it.
I'm still alive.
I mean, you look pretty good.
Pretty good is not quite good. I'm going to be 70 next birthday, and I ran up a hill yesterday. I run.
Okay.
And I think they can't find anything wrong with it.
But a lot of guys didn't make it.
Well, I don't know why. I mean, my grandfather lived to be 100. But see, I quit smoking cigarettes. I mean, so I don't have that.
Okay.
I mean, somebody said once that a cat wouldn't even eat your liver. Well, I mean, every time I go over to the VA, which I'm going to go tomorrow morning, they can't find that. They said there's nothing wrong with you. I got the results from my blood work. They said you're vitamin D deficient. I guess that's the new big thing. But now, I mean, because in the wintertime, the sun, I sit out in the sun. I mean, I can't even get a sunburn. I don't know if it's because of my pigmentation or whatever. But
wow. Well, how is Woody Herman different from...
Okay, well, let's go. Well, let's jump. All right, came back after Maynard's band. Went back with Gap Mangione for another year. Then Woody Herman's band called, and I went with that band. And that band was an exciting band. It was one of the bands I wanted to play with. It was, we all, La Fiesta. I had played La Fiesta with Maynard Ferguson for 2 years, and now I'm back playing La Fiesta with Woody Herman for another 2 years, which is basically a slightly different version because it doesn't have all of the high featuring Maynard and that, but I liked Four Brothers, Early Autumn, all of that stuff. I mean, all of those things, you know. But the high point of being with that band was the Carnegie Hall concert we did, which was the 40th anniversary concert. I really enjoyed, I mean, everybody was there, all of them, you know, the whole thing in 1976. They made a record on RCA, the 40th anniversary concert live at Carnegie Hall. And I was loaded for that one too. But I enjoyed it. And Jake, the three drummers were me, Jake Hanna, and Don Lamont. I've got a picture of the three of us together. We shared the drum chairs on that.
Jake, he was a pistol, huh?
He was a character. He used to come into Eddie Condon's all the time. Whenever I used to see him all the time. I mean, not all the time, whenever he was in New York, because I was the house drummer at Eddie Condon's for 3 years too, which was another Dixieland club. But then on Sundays I had the Metropolitan Opera House, my own band, you know.
Yeah.
But and then I'd play bass, he'd play drums, and some other guys would play piano. So after hours, I even got to play with Roy Haynes, playing drums, and I'm playing bass. I got to play with some pretty good drummers at Eddie Condon's because I played bass, you know, with that. I mean, Jimmy Campbell, who had been with Woody earlier on, Jackie Williams,
Jackie.
Earl Palmer. Anybody who would come in would want to sit in, and so I'd play bass, and somebody else would play piano, and we'd play until 4 in the morning. The club was open until 4 in the morning. Woody would be, all the musicians wound up hanging out there because the club was open till 4. So it was like an after hours hang. We would stop playing at 1:30 or 2, and for 2 more hours the place would be open, and you never know who was going to be coming in. Sarah Vaughan, anybody. Joe Jones would be at the end of the bar playing on a newspaper with brushes. You know?
That guy loved to do that, didn't he?
Yeah, right, right.
What were the toughest economic years for you as far as gigs?
Not too, I don't remember. Well, Eddie Condon's closed in 1985. Both of my sons graduated from high school in 1985 and went to college in 1985. And there was a little lull in there that it was a little nerve-wracking. But my one son, the bassist, got a full paid scholarship to Boston Conservatory, so that helped. The other one went to the Manhattan School of Music and then decided he wanted to become a physicist, so that took care of that.
Wow.
And I was working various jobs in New York, and then Anita O'Day came into the game, and then I was with her. That was a funny one, man. Well, then Buddy Rich, I went to Florida for a few years. I ran the band down there at Marco Island, Florida, and that was fun for a while. I brought Steve Marcus down, but then the Buddy Rich band got the call. I played Carnegie Hall with that band. But I mean, that was kind of ridiculous. I mean, I did the Blue Note with them and some jobs with that band, but I never, be honest with you, I mean, the guy, Buddy Rich was a freak of nature, there's no question about that. But I never even listened to that band's music particularly because I said, I'm never going to have to play with that band.
I see.
So I get to Eddie Condon's, my first week at Eddie Condon's, the phone rings at lunchtime. I'm at home, I'm staying in an apartment with a friend. And it's Richie Bars from Willard Alexander's office, and he said, Buddy Rich had a heart attack out in Ann Arbor, Michigan. We need a drummer on that bandstand tonight. I said, oh, jeez. First of all, Buddy there were no drum parts for that band because I don't know if it's rumored he couldn't read music. So here I am, I said, well, how are you going to get me? He said, we'll get you on an airplane. They took me from the airport to the stage to play with that band. You want to talk about I had to baste myself in my own sweat, you know. I mean, and I did that a couple of times, and then when he died, I played with the band for a short time after that. But I mean, you can't really replace those bands. just doesn't work. I mean, they're the stars. Maynard Ferguson's band now. I mean, guys can play high notes, but it's not Maynard Ferguson. You know? Buddy Rich. I mean, Woody Herman band can go on because he was just more or less like, you know, Glenn Miller had so many hits. The Glenn Miller band's probably working more than any other big band. You know,
it's something. Yeah, he had a less personalized sound. You could.
Who's that? Glenn Miller.
Glenn Miller.
Well, I wouldn't say that because he had that clarinet lead.
Oh yeah.
But the thing is that he was smart, man. Half of the tunes that he made popular were public domain. Little Brown Jug, American Patrol. I can't remember all of them, but he didn't have to pay any royalties on those tunes. You know, so I mean, you know, he made a fortune. I mean, well, of course, there's some different opinions on that. Some people say that Glenn Miller should have lived and his music should have died. Other people say that he should have. Let's see. He should have. The plane should have gone down with him and the music in it. You know, certain guys. But I mean, I enjoyed playing with the band. I learned a lot because Buddy DeFranco was so strict. You know, like with the things. So I did learn a lot from playing with that band.
Yeah.
And that thing right there, that's a plaque of Platitude. We did a Glenn Miller In the Mood. That went million. What's the Platitude? That's $1 million, isn't it? Seller, and it went. We did 3 of them, and it's gone triple platinum with the 3 of them.
Oh, darn.
But that's from that In the Christmas Mood.
Do you get payments, royalties for any of the stuff you've done?
Not for that. Well, yeah. That thing I get royalties because they use some of the music in 2 more. They use it in, well, Sandra Bullock's While You Were Sleeping, and then there's another one I think called The Little, how do you say it, Folkers or The Little something.
Oh yeah, the Meet the Fockers
or something
the
like that.
Second.
They use some of that music in that, and I get some minor royalties.
I see. Let's suppose
Let me give you some, but let's move on into Anita O'Day.
Yeah.
Now this is I did a record with her out in California.
Anita O'Day, okay.
For some reason she came into the picture because it's the Gene Krupa legend. They were trying to, I call it humping the grave. They just keep trying to hump the grave, man. You know, like, so now here is Anita O'Day playing at Michael's Pub in New York. And I had worked with her with a Buddy Rich band at the Blue Note. And they brought some drummer in from Boston who, I don't know, whatever happened. I don't even know who he was or what he was, but he lasted about 1 night, and she was pretty rough to deal with. And so she remembered me from there. She said, get that drummer that was with Buddy Rich's band. So I went in, worked with her at Michael's Pub for 10 weeks, something like that. And then I went on the road with her, went to Europe with her, and went to Japan a couple times with her, and recorded with her out at Vine Street with Pete Jolly and all of those guys. But man, did she and I ever become drinking partners. Woo, and she could drink.
Okay, suppose I have a grandson, and he's a very good musician, and he wants to be a jazz musician, and he's debating about college, or he just wants to go to New York City and be a musician. And I asked you, what do you think about that? You think I should encourage that kid to do such a thing?
Well, along my lines, where I had twin sons, and I wanted one of them to be a piano player and the other one to be a drummer. Well, the drummer became a very good drummer. I mean, grade 6A solos in fifth or sixth grade. Then I had a set of vibes because I figured he's going to get into percussion, got to learn all of that. And then I had that bass in the corner, and one day he said, "What's that?" "That's a string bass." And he said, and I gave him his first bass lesson. Well, that ended it. That was it for him. I mean, bass was his instrument. Now, he just took to it. I mean, it's like me: piano, trumpet, drums, and then bass as a secondary instrument. He just loved it, and it hurt his hands. I mean, and my grandson wanted to be like Grandpa, played drums. That didn't. I had a house full of drums, and he had drums at home. That didn't work for him. Then he tried the bass because of his father. That didn't work. Now he's got my father's trumpet, and he loves it. And he's just playing in the band and everything else. But my son, who does play with, he makes a lot of money, his pension's going to be ridiculous, is a professional musician at the Kennedy Center. His bass never even leaves the building. Although he did go with the National Symphony over to China and Korea and all this and that, touring whenever they tour. But you gotta let them find their own way, man. It's like, you can't say, first of all, the thing that amazes me is that they have all of these universities and schools now. I never attended an institution of higher learning. As I said, I didn't go to Ithaca College, so but I gave seminars and clinics at colleges, when I was with those bands. They wanted to know what I knew, which I learned, from the seat of my pants. But the thing is that the thing that I'm not getting is all of these schools have all of these things, all of this music that we didn't have available to us. It's all there now. I've got a whole big band, stacks of music, which was not available when I was coming up. But a school teacher, he gets a job, he graduates from college, and instead, he might, if he's lucky, and even that's slowing down, get a cruise ship for a couple months, get on one of those ships, but they're even cutting back. A drummer might, because half of the music, it's a drummer playing along with a keyboard player and a soundtrack, so all of that's shutting down. The big bands are basically, the Basie band, how much can they work? Woody Herman's band maybe works 15 weeks a year. There's no bands to go on anymore, so going to New York, even the studio work. Now Broadway, I don't know, because I never was into the Broadway. I worked at Roseland Ballroom, this and that, but I don't see it. It's kind of like you go to college to learn how to be a teacher, so you can teach somebody else how to be a teacher. But how do you get actually involved with what you're being taught, other than to be a teacher? So it's like there's no light through the tunnel.
What's the scene?
Yeah, what's the scene? I go into Central Park now, and I hear guys playing their asses off, but they got their cases open for nickels and dimes and quarters and a couple $1 bills that they probably put in there themselves. So I don't recommend getting in the music business. I caught the tail end of it with the guys that were still alive, not Glenn Miller, but I was on Woody Herman's band, and I was on the Maynard Ferguson band. I was with Anita O'Day and things like that. Right. But I was not Eddie. I was with Eddie Jefferson the night he was murdered, the singer. I was playing with him in Baker's Keyboard Lounge. The great vocalist, he was another hero of mine, and he had said that we're going to go into the Vanguard and this and that, and everything was fine, Richie Cole and all this and that. And I walked out of the vestibule of the club on opening night at Baker's Keyboard Lounge. There was a Lincoln Continental out front. I got to town late, so thank God I got to town late, otherwise Eddie would have been riding with me, and I checked into a different motel around the corner, and I got in my car, drove around the corner, getting ready for a nice week with Eddie, and turned on the television. It said jazz singer Eddie Jefferson was murdered last night in front of Baker's Keyboard Lounge. When I called Richie Cole, they said, "Danny, you missed it by 30 seconds." Man, if I had got to town later or earlier, I would have been standing right there. Shotgun took him down, So I just got in the car and drove straight home. I said, "Let me get out of here. Detroit's not my town for this." But that was with Eddie Jefferson. I loved him. I loved working with him too. Mm-hmm. But no, I can't recommend going into this business. You're involved with it. I don't know. There's so many guys out there that are just ridiculous, and girls now. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if the race thing is involved, or if I don't know. I'm not in the game anymore. I'm not in the competition. I don't need a gig anymore. You know, I don't need one.
Did you ever witness any racial incidents or that kind of thing in your career? I know, as you said, your time in the business was supposedly a little after much of that was worked out.
Yeah, I had one. I was, I auditioned with Horace Silver. He just died, by the way.
Yeah.
Randy Brecker was on the band. Benny Maupin. Can't remember the bass. Can't remember the bass player. And Horace. And so they were holding auditions up at Lynn Oliver's studio. Mike Garson got me the audition. He was David Bowie's conductor for, I don't know, forever. And I went up there and I played first. I mean, no, I was the only white guy auditioning on drums. Billy Cobham was leaving, and a replacement was being held for him. And I mean, auditions were taking place. And one guy played, a black guy played. He wasn't particularly good. He wasn't very good. So, but Horace was nice about it. Let him play a couple tunes. Then called me up, and I played about four or five tunes with him. And then everybody's sitting over there. Then another black guy comes up to play drums. Better than the first, but not particularly good. And he said, "Danny, why don't you come on up and play some more?" So I played another 3 or 4 tunes with Horace Silver. So now Mike Garson's there, and we're waiting to go down to Dave Liebman's loft to have a session, but we're waiting for Randy Brecker to come down. Now Benny Maupin, the tenor player, who had been with Headhunters, by the way, during my first sitting down to play the drums, walked to the other end of the studio and played against the wall. Wouldn't come up on the stand and play with me. But when Horace called me up the second time, he came up on there's a little raised platform at Lynn Oliver's studio, and did play with me. And Randy Brecker, so we're waiting for Randy downstairs. It's like a half an hour, man. And we're going down to Liebman's, and he said, "Horace wants to hire you, man, but he says he knows that if he puts a white drummer on this band, he said it's going to cost him about 40% of his work." So we went down.
Who said that to you?
Randy Brecker.
Okay.
Because they had a band meeting up there.
I see.
He said he wants to use you, but he can't. So we went down, and the next morning I'm staying at Mike Garson's house, and the phone rings, and Mike said, "Danny, it's Horace Silver." And I said, "What?" I must have got the gig. Horace Silver's calling me. And Horace said, you don't forget it when you get a call from Horace Silver. He said, "Danny, it was obvious you were far superior to all those other drummers there. But there's one other guy I want to hear in Philadelphia." And that guy lasted about a week, but I felt a racial, I felt a draft, as you would say.
Draft. That's.
No, I'm not saying that I would have lasted a week either, but at least I played better than the guys that were there, you know.
That's ironic because they told Benny Goodman the same thing. You're going to lose 40% of your work, if you hire Lionel Hampton or whatever.
Yeah, Artie Shaw had that whole scene when he had Hot Lips Page, and he couldn't even do a Southern tour unless Hot Lips was like at least 10 feet away from the rest of the band. He turned down the whole Southern tour. And Billie Holiday was with that band too, and there were some problems along those lines too. But I mean, other than that, I can't say there's been an awful lot, as far as I'm concerned, with the black and white thing.
Do you think if you could be born at a different time, did you ever feel like you were born a little too late?
I'm not, since I'm now still alive, no.
That's a good answer.
Because I would have been long gone.
That's a great answer.
But guys have told me that geez, if you were around in the 40s and that, like Stan Getz offered me a gig that night at Carnegie Hall right after the gig. We went up to the party afterwards because we did this thing And he played with the band, and he said, when you get off this band, call me. I never did. But I don't think, I understand that he was not the most fun guy to
I see.
work with.
Yeah. Well, I'm jealous of some of your playing experiences because I oftentimes think I was born, a little too late. But we're both still here.
That's the nice part.
I'm going to remember that answer.
Yeah, but still alive. If I was born, I'd be gone, long gone. But man, I can't say that I have an awful lot of regrets in my life. I mean, my life ambition was in high school was to someday play with Woody Herman's band and Maynard Ferguson's band, and I had achieved both of that by the time I was 27. So, I mean, I was offered Count Basie's band, and I was with. I mean, it said, and I was with Maynard's band, and I said no. I was offered that twice, I think. I am kind of regretful that I turned it down, although I do have a feeling that the intensity that I was playing and the style that I was playing and accustomed to playing with Maynard's band, I might not have been, it would have taken some adjusting for me to go with Basie's band, because we were on top of everything. We were playing way on top of the beat, and with Basie it was much more laid back, and Basie might have had to have a talk with me or something if I had taken the job.
I see. I find that fascinating, this idea playing on top of the beat. You know, how can you, I heard Louis Hayes one night in some club, and I said, oh my, he is so on top of the beat, how does this music not speed up? Well, maybe it does.
Maybe it does. Well, you see, I don't know, because each guy's got a different cymbal beat. Jimmy Cobb, you would think he would be playing quarter notes, but he's actually playing a real tight 16th note. But you see, what I did was the way my father, when he first showed me the beat, he said, this is the way the beat goes, and he had to do it with two hands. But the way I practiced it was I would go. So if you play it a flam, see, then you're not playing it right as far as I'm concerned. So it's got to be. So it's like. Rather than. Because then the right stick is not where I hear the time, so it's like the swinging thing. So like I always play it that way, and then some guys just play straight quarter note, like that. And then and Cozy Cobe almost played it. I mean, I never could quite figure that one out.
Wow.
But each guy's got their own cymbal beat. Louis Hayes, and each guy works differently. Works better with certain bass players. Like Louis Hayes and Sam Jones hit it beautifully, and also Philly Joe Jones and Paul Chambers hit it beautifully. But Louis Hayes and Paul Chambers didn't hit it as well, and Philly Joe didn't hit it quite as well with Sam Jones. So everybody's got their own time feel that works for them. It's, bass players. For me, I mean, I'm very particular about bass players. And they're really, if I'm going to be able to be free, I know that if my arm starts to hurt, I'm doing something, I'm trying to adjust to something.
Oh.
That's just me. But I'll tell you one thing. In parting, how much, you got about 30 seconds left?
All right.
A tom-tom can't be played by every tom-tom, dick, and Harry.
All right. I can't think of a better ending. It's been a real pleasure.
It's been my pleasure.
And you know what? I hope I get to play with you someday. Maybe I can keep up. I'm not sure.
Right there.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Danny.
You're more than welcome.